Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kuang, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is Jane Shi, a poet, editor, and the author of her debut poetry collection, Echolalia. She is an alumnus of the 10 House Summer Workshop, the Writer's Studio online at Simon Fraser University, and StoryStudio Chicago. In this conversation, we explore Jane's early connection to poetry and wordplay, the ethos behind her collection, and the illusory nature of writer's block. Living on the stolen and occupied lands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, she wants to live in a world where love is not a limited resource, land is not mined, hearts are not filched, and bodies are not violated. You can find more side-by-side episodes at sidebyside.podcast.podbean.com. And if you'd like to connect with me about my services, please visit www.robertquanhome.com. To start this conversation, please enjoy Jane's reading of her poem, Azure Road.
Azure Road. Your parents aren't ping pong tables, a platter of paranoias, or the pinging for, I need to poo. They are just people. Vomiting out carrot cubes, your first lesson in boundary setting. Dodoba anamorphs into promising you won't speak to them again. An idiom fathers a child, called memorization, who kicks mother, repetition, tries to run away, forgets Weishima. You do not family good is an idiom you made up to protect yourself from little miss disappointments. Behind her, a dog putters across the long carpeted corridor. Only responds to, why continue? Stay is not a command. Offer yourself cul-de-sac questions. If they do not want you, do you good enough, good enough? An upturned bag emptying, perhaps you still hope that someday someone will scoop you up. All this was a dream, a test. You are not a pottery wheels lump of regret. Raymond lost the election that year, but you are not Raymond. You do not need to win to live.
Thank you for reading that, especially when you're feeling a little bit under the weather today. I'm so honored to be connecting with Jane Shi. Oh, I said it wrong.
It's okay.
I'm so happy to be connected with Jane today and reading some of her poetry and just talking about writing. So how are you doing today, Jane?
I'm okay. I am feeling a little under the weather, but still in good spirits overall. So just kind of like in a restful mood.
And your debut collection of poems, Echolalia, just came out last fall. So it hasn't been that long since you've started all of the running around activities around that. How has that been for you after the publishing experience?
Yeah, honestly, it was really sweet and really wholesome so far. I was really nervous and just kind of a lot of nervous energy prior to this book coming out. I had all sorts of it just felt like there was a lot of tension that I was holding in my body, but after the book came out I was like, oh, okay, I feel better. So
Yeah.
even though there were a lot of things I had to do, it didn't feel too bad.
And it was such an honor to hear you do a reading. One of the first writerly experiences I had in Vancouver was going to kind of a launch event for you and hearing other poets as well. And it was such a nice introduction to Vancouver life, which is where we're at right now. Like, I wanted to thank you for that, and just being able to hear your poetry felt like I could settle in here as a writer and also as an artist. And you and I have something in common in our history. I came to the United States from China when I was 9, and I believe you also moved to Canada from China when you were younger, correct?
Yeah, I was 7 when our family immigrated here.
And I always say that definitely impacted my writing and my view of the world, and using writing to maybe understand the world in some ways. So that was sort of the way that I saw it when I was younger, I suppose. But what was it like navigating, moving from China to Canada? And did it have an impact in your creativity and artistic life?
Absolutely. I honestly don't know who I would be if it were not for that experience. I would be another person probably, but as a child, I was very into stories. I actually memorized stories. Like I listened to audio cassette tapes. I would have, yeah, all of these stories I would just recite and I would sing songs. And I think that is an interesting background to come from when you are going into another country where you're kind of learning a new language and then in the process losing your previous ones. I think that poetry and writing and art in a general way were ways to express myself when the stressors of learning to adapt in a new world was too much in a lot of ways. I think that poetry is sort of this place where you can play with grammar, play with sound in ways that are more forgiving for people who are maybe not feeling like they're fluent in the language, but also like wanting to create, like make language their own.
Right. So much of that resonates because one of the first experiences that I remember after coming to America was me watching with my parents The Sound of Music, because that was something that I could sort of understand and wrap my head around because it's mostly music based, especially in the first half, right? I remember even that having another medium or another way to be exposed to this new language was helpful. And it was kind of helped me build a bridge into like, oh, yeah, I can understand this. This is just people. But it kind of sounds like writing and creativity and journaling and storytelling was your way to do that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to share an example
Yes, please.
that I always think about. My family took over a copy of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and it had English on one side and Chinese on the other. And so as a child, my mother probably read the Chinese version to me. And when I learned English and subsequently didn't really learn how to read in Chinese, I like looked at the English version. And so probably subconsciously I already had the story in my head. But there was that iconic poem inside that book called The Jabberwocky. And I, for some reason, felt compelled to memorize it because the sounds were so irresistible. 'Twas brillig and the slidey toves, blah, blah, blah. As a child, I really wanted to kind of emulate that wordplay where you're like, what is even going on? What does this mean? It somehow like created this story, this world. There's a sort of like mystery about it. I enjoyed mystery as a child and I still do. I think that there was that curiosity element, but there was also an element of wanting to make myself obscure to other people. Because when you read that poem, you're like, what is even going on? Um, and so I think that with poetry, you can be very, very honest, but somehow be very, very obscure. I think that for me, that was a way that I protected myself as a kid.
Yeah, that explains so much of my own creative writing back then. It was just such a nice outlet, and it was a way to process things that made yourself feel more safe and protected in many ways. So that definitely resonates with me. Do you remember some of so that was like one of your first memories of poetry?
Yeah, I mean, probably like more literally, my first memory of poetry is memorizing Li Bai's Quiet Night Think.
In
um,
Mandarin?
yeah,
Oh.
in a more literal sense, right? Like the act of memorizing that poem and reciting it was probably my first actual poem, like
Yeah.
relationship to a poem. But there is like a link here between that poem and Jabberwocky because they both really, really relish in the rhythm, pausing over each word. And so I think that they're both interesting lessons for me growing up.
Oh my gosh, I love talking to poets. I say this because I'm not a self-proclaimed poet, but somehow it makes the process even more enjoyable for me because you love wordplay in a way that I can appreciate, maybe as someone with more of like academic writing, you know what I'm saying? And there's so much freedom in poetry. You know, when I went to English school, I read Shakespeare, read the Odyssey, but it was T.S. Eliot that I first really started falling in love with poetry and analyzing the four quartets and things like that. And I just could not believe how much depth. There was just so much to unpack in fewer word count. And that kind of like changed my mind. But I was already in college by then, so I wasn't really spending my time exploring wordplay on the page like you were. So I really, really respect that. In fact, some of your poetry from the collection were from like your teenage years and from when you were younger, right?
Yeah, actually, someone in my life basically insisted that I showed this person years and years ago. This person is also an author. Over a decade ago, he was reading my WordPress blog from when I was a teenager. Like over the span of several years, I accumulated a bunch of poems. He was just like, "You have to edit this and put it in a collection." And I was just like, okay. But then when I did actually go back to read those poems, I was really, really curious. I was really fascinated because my writing style changed so much between then and now. I had not been, because that time I had no idea what the poetry world is like in local spaces. There are a lot of people, young people, who are in youth poetry spaces, and I was never in that when I was younger. It
Mm.
was just me and the WordPress, me and this empty box.
You were the introverted writer.
Yeah, yeah. And because I wasn't exposed to other poets, I didn't feel inhibited by certain mores or certain styles. I was reading at the time when I was a teenager, I was reading Chuck Palahniuk. And the reason I read Chuck Palahniuk is because of Panic at the Disco's first album. I write Sins Not Tragedies. That is important lore. And then I was reading, Vladimir Nabokov. I was reading Stephen King. Like, my style was super
Mhm.
gritty and raw in ways that I just don't quite write like that anymore because I was very, very uninhibited as a young person. And I was like,
Mm.
oh, this is so interesting. I love this. And so that was the process for that poem because I wanted to honor that like older writing style. And it was still like super, it was just gave me lots to play with. I was really chuffed when I went through those words again.
I mean, that sounds like such a positive experience because writing is kind of a time capsule.
Yeah.
As our taste and style changes, there's definitely I've had some very cringy reactions to my old writing. But there was something really empowering and inspiring about reading your collection and kind of seeing, number one, to dive in a little bit, just the variety in form, I would say even texture, and just you are playing with so many different things in your work that I just admire so much. And so there's that effect of like every poem is different from the other, and that's okay. Even if some was from the past and some was from, last year, who knows? I wanted to talk about how you opened in your acknowledgments in your collection. You wrote, "For the mouth sewed shut, mumbling, water, what water?" Do you want to share a little bit about this acknowledgement and what you meant by that?
So I was going through some really difficult things in the last decade of my life, and I was thinking a lot about the feeling that I guess to go back to the feeling that I had to protect myself as a kid, where you feel like you can't say certain things. but you say it in code in poetry or something. I think that this dedication is sort of about what people can't say in public, what people are punished if they were to say. It's kind of also examining the relationship between saying things and thirst and hunger as like survival things, right? And how connected it is to be able to speak your truth. And what does it mean to have your mouth sewed shut but you're still mumbling? Somebody can silence you. Like the world can silence you, but they can't silence you completely. So even if you're mumbling your truth, you're still saying it in some way.
Yeah, I definitely got it was kind of honoring writing as an acknowledgement of censorship, but also self-censorship, both
Yes.
and still putting the work out and still putting pen to paper. So yeah, I thank you for expanding on that a little bit because definitely, like you say, the words are up for interpretation, but so resonant and honest in some ways, and it definitely struck me when I read it. And there's something to be said about reading poetry, especially for your collection, because there's the experience of reading your work and then there's experience of hearing your work. There are some things that I feel like you can only experience with your work on paper as an experience. And so like how have you navigated the writing experience and for publishing print, but also if and when you have to read or it's more of a listening experience and you're at a mic? Like how much did you think about that? Or was it just like, I'm just going to see what happens and this is what came out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the book objects is something that I thought a lot about. I had put out a chapbook, but I like when you're writing a book, you have to think about like why is this a book specifically? And so there are some things that can be done in a book that isn't quite done on the stage. I really, really admire slam poets. I think that I started writing poetry more specifically because I went to slam events. I went to local poetry events in that way.
Oh my gosh, did you do some? Did
No,
you did you go
that's the
up?
thing. People always thought that I did, but I didn't. Maybe like did a few open mics here and there, but I never like did any competitions. I was just like, this is too much. And I say this as somebody who judged, so maybe that's because I'm a coward.
There I was like, oh, these are the extroverted
Yeah,
writers,
yes, exactly. Yes.
performers. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, like I do think about both things simultaneously, but because this is a book, I thought a lot more about what could be done with the visuals, but also because I learned with Diana Coyne Nguyen how to do certain formatting things. I was just like, okay, this is like a real space to play with as well. There's like a lot that could be done with these words. Yeah, especially because if you play with the sounds of the words or the image of like one word itself, you can play with the whole shape of the poem. And so, as you say, textures, that's something that can also be done with a physical book because it is textured.
Yeah, I loved it and I was very inspired. Once again, my appreciation of poetry is just always like whenever you feel boxed in and limited, check in with a poet just to remind yourself you can do a lot more. You have a lot more freedom. And also specifically for print poetry, I thought it was so effective. I had some peers who wrote maybe like a play script with some formatting things, but it's not going to be felt once it goes into production. This is just what the experience is, when you're reading the collection. And you did things like, I can't even count all the different techniques and effects, but putting print over print to make it murky and hard to read. You've got poetry that mirror each other, more like sibling poems. And you had poems where the print started to fade. And the one about ancestors was the one that made me cry, by the way. It was the last line.
Yeah.
What was it? How do you pronounce my name or something like that? It hit someplace deep within me, apparently.
Yeah.
And so fading text and just, and again, formatting in every which way that people could imagine. So if you're interested in that, you should definitely get Jane's collection just to see what is possible. And again, it's just printed pages on paper. Nothing super groundbreaking, but here you are doing some things I've never seen before. Kudos. I don't know which one you had the most fun or some of them were suggestions where you just went for it, but I mean, every poem was its own distinct signature, or at least that's how I felt as a reader.
I think that maybe it's worth mentioning that for the last few years, probably start of undergrad, but before that as well, I was interested in film. And in undergrad, I did make a few films, and I actually wrote some video poems. And I think that definitely influenced all these shapes because with videos, you have to think about where everything is placed, and your canvas is
Mhm.
a different size. So like when you flip over the page sideways, you get sort of a screen, and that is why the Mountains May Depart poem has that quality, because I was directly just using the three aspect ratios that the film used to represent these three periods of time in that film.
Yeah, there was a visual nature even in your poems that have no visuals to it. Nevertheless, you use the formatting of print and also just the words, using the words as shapes to make new shapes. Again, I had a very, very striking and unique experience and things I've never seen in other spaces before. And it's also really encouraging, by the way, to hear that it took time to put together this collection and you put your heart and soul into it. Is that just your philosophy? There is no limit. Do you just experiment and see what happens? Or how did you start to open up creatively?
Part of it is that I had really amazing editors, and I was able to work with some really cool people in the last couple of years through both my chapbook, Leaving Chang'e Unread with Rahila's Ghost Press, and Echolalia with Brick Books.
Mm-hmm.
And also because I really think about gestalt as well. Like sometimes I can't read. What I mean gestalt is like the shape of a whole rather than just the details. When you're reading a poem, you're like each word, but like if you can't look at something closely because it is too hard, or if your mind is somewhere else, you still have the shape. So like you can
Okay.
access the poem on like multiple levels. All throughout like editing this collection, there were times where there were certain poems that I couldn't read, but I could like play with the shape forever. Yeah, I really think that a lot of it goes back to like my previous instinct to protect myself as a kid. I think about if you can say this difficult thing, but have it be in a shape that feels like you can handle. That was sort of the philosophy of editing these poems. There are times where I'm like looking at the words, I'm like, it's not that I hate the words, but it's that the feelings that came with it were difficult. But what if I put these difficult things in symmetry? What if I repeated it in
Mm.
different iterations? What if I faded it out? What if I tried to mimic nature? Or what if I resembled the film? Or what if I put it in a CD format? Or split it in half, and poets like Douglas Kearney, Diana Coy Nguyen, Layla Lee Long Soldier are all poets who really, really play with form in that way. And through those strategies, they say something specific that wouldn't be said if it weren't in that form. Also, like Tayemba Jess Olio as well. I was just like, symmetry is so interesting. It's so there is a lesson in all of this mess. I like for example, like to name another really nerdy example, my poem about being a Tool fan, I use the Fibonacci sequence in how I
You fucking nerd. Are
I
you
know
kidding?
I am a nerd. Um,
Okay, wait. Just you have to explain it because I don't even know. What do you mean?
okay, the Fibonacci sequence is the golden ratio in nature, right? So I don't exactly remember the numbers. Like it's like 112, and then it sort of gradually spirals out. And that's how you
Yeah.
make the all of these shapes in nature, whether it is these shells or these formations, or how we as humans read, understand symmetry or beauty or whatever. And so this band from the 90s, they're still around, called Tool, which I really enjoyed as a teenager. They wrote
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a song called Lateralis where they had the chords in Fibonacci sequence. And I was like obsessed with this because I was just like, this is like, it just stimulated that part of my brain that liked to put things together in that way. And just like, I know that it's a little, silly, but
No.
it was very like compelling to me. I was just like, if I'm going to write a poem about Tool, it has to be like formatted in the Fibonacci sequence. So I used the line breaks and the tabs in that format, and that created a sort of like a
Oh.
wave in each stanza that I really enjoyed, because I was also talking about EMDR in the poem, and EMDR, you kind of look back, it's that bilateral stimulation thing, and I was just like, it all kind of comes together somehow. Yeah.
No, it does. It does. It's super cool because I sometimes talk about this in a more of a woo-woo Oprah way, let's just say. But you sound like you really know how to follow your inspiration and you just go for it. And I feel like with writers, a lot of our blocks can be about, fear of trying things and also just kind of what is the right decision. How did you navigate those things when you're playing with form so freely? And how did you just kind of remain uninhibited, if that makes sense?
The philosophy or approach of the collection is that we as humans, and me as a queer autistic person of the diaspora, we have to kind of be chameleons. We have to change who we are sometimes on in a heartbeat to adapt to different situations. So I think that that was the approach that I took with form throughout this collection. And in a more specific way with each poem, it's like sometimes the subject kind of demands that I use a certain form. The Latewood poem, it has a sort of like a ring like spiral a little bit. As one example, the Hofflakes Not Firecrackers poem, I traced an image of Tanghulu. Pirated DVDs are my cousins. I chose a play button, like the button that you click play. That plus the poem that is shaped like a CD. There's like this ode to like the older formats of playing music in a way that might get lost in the digital era that we're in. My editor, Phoebe Wang, kind of suggested that 100 punchlines to procrastinate kicking your bucket could be kind of like credits, like rolling credits at the end of a film, and being close to the end of the collection. And the poem Love's Eat, obviously there is like an acknowledgement of the actual couch format where there's two parts and then they're put together. It's sort of like when you're writing a poem, like the shape almost comes together on its own if you're writing about a specific kind of thing.
I love the ones that kind of look like to-do list or like they look like Sims bars to me, you know? And I don't know what your specific inspiration was, but I've never seen that particular way of looking at wording and meaning and poetry. And yeah, I had to shout that out as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite, I guess, like a favorite piece that you wrote or like a piece that particularly sticks out for you in the collection for any reason?
I was very surprised. My poem Industry of Caring, it was originally just those words and not the collage. Cynthia Dewey Oka suggested that I use a collage form just like Douglas Kearney's poems. And I was really, really curious. I was like, okay, what exactly? Because I had seen Douglas Kearney's work before, but I hadn't seriously figured out like what his process was. So I like took some time to listen to him talk about it. And he talked about how a lot of the poems he wrote, and they're very visual, they're using old texts, and the texts are actually from the 1800s. And he got those specific words from the specific collages, so to speak, visual topography, he would say, from Google Books, because the copyright licensing has expired, so you can like freely use those. And so I had spent maybe like 10 minutes writing the words years ago of this poem, but I spent such a long time composing the actual collage because I brought in like so many different sources. And I was really like thinking about what Douglas was talking about in terms of like when you bring in these textures, you bring in some of the spirit of what the original text. So when he uses really, really racist old texts to speak back to anti-blackness or America or masculinity or patriarchy, like it sort of retains that problematic spirit of that original text. And so I think that this poem like is like fun for me because I get to think about all of these different documents that I was looking at, including a bunch of books and dictionaries that my friends' grandparents left behind. Originally, they were involved with the Chinatown Library Association, and a lot of those books originally came from there. And then when they had to sell the house in old age, a lot of these books went back to the association, and some of them, my friend didn't want these books to go to waste, so she like gave them to me. And I was like, had all these intentions to do something with these texts or research them or whatever, but in the end it was actually the literal physical letters that I used. Yeah, and I think that element of like what does the typography or the original document do in a poem works really well for this particular subject matter.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of I saw an opera that was about Angel Island in New York, and it was inspired by the poems that like Chinese immigrants who spent time at Angel Island carved into the wood of where they were staying. And so just having like images of like the carvings of the poetry in the slabs of wood where they were like, you know, holding centers and things like that, where it was so evocative. And the way you were describing your process reminded me of how they viewed the words, the poetry, but also the impact and what it means. Thank you for talking about your process, because sometimes the writerly process is not just about the word count or the words themselves, but you had a whole process after the words had already been set that was equally impactful. You know, and I'm assuming maybe you were thinking about publishing and things like that. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear about your process. And you've also mentioned a lot of peers and your support group, your community really being able to give you feedback and things like that. How did you choose when or who to share certain things with, especially before they were published?
I feel pretty comfortable sharing my first drafts with friends and a few writing friends as well. I think that though with the process of creating a book, I really did want to talk with other poets. And that is one of the reasons why I was really excited to do the writer's studio at SFU. The mentor that I had was Kayla Zaga. At Tin House, I worked with Diana Coy Nguyen. And I think that, like, in those spaces, you can ask some really pointed questions about poetry, impact of the words, for somebody who doesn't know about your context at all, who has like just a poet perspective. And I think that that is just so invaluable. And also, I care a lot about the political impact of a poem too. Like, I think having poets who share a similar kind of ethic, like my poet friend Sho Yamakushiku, really was supportive in that way. Just because thinking about editing a poem is not only about the craft of the words, but also about the impact, what it does in the world, how it can be read in all these different ways. And so I think that having like a balance of both of them really helped me feel more comfortable putting this book out in the world.
Do you have any advice for specifically, let's say, poets working with editors and what that may look like? I guess I would say, as someone with more experience in prose, I always was curious about that, how to actually improve upon a poem essentially, and what to think about. You've given so many interesting and again really inspired examples of this already, so I want to acknowledge that. But like, do you have any advice for working with editors specifically?
I think that like one thing that I learned that I was really grateful for is that if you understand the stylistic or different approach that the editor that you're working with has, you might be able to say, oh, this is really good advice, and I will only take some of it because I want to retain my the original spirit. This is not quite in my style, or I disagree with this reading. Yeah, I think that like the editorial process is very much like a conversation where you're like almost figuring out on the go like what is the poem that you're writing. It's sort of like the poem might be a little fuzzy in the beginning, but then as you go through the process, it becomes clearer. Yeah, like my editor at Brick, Phoebe Wang, was really, really supportive, and that was really, really helpful.
Yeah.
I had all these different ideas, but I think it takes time to get to know more of the technical side of editing a manuscript. I think that was definitely something that I like learned on the go. But I do think that at the end of the day, like it's sort of about like deciding, hey, this is my approach, this is my style. There is no universal like right way to do this work. It's like figuring out what is your voice, what is your mark.
Yeah, I love what you said about it's a relationship, so it's like a dance between two people that you cultivate. And also that there are some practical ways in which you can kind of assess the relationship based on who they've worked with before. But yeah, that was really interesting to hear because I think a lot of people can struggle with editing, I suppose, for lack of better phrasing. So this is like a good process, especially for poets as well, because again, I think maybe there's some assumption, especially with shorter poems, like maybe the person just wrote it, put it on a piece of paper, and now it's published, and that's really not the case at all. So,
Mm-hmm.
so anything to demystify that part as well is really helpful. Assuming, of course, if you've experienced things like writer's block or taken some breaks from writing or had periods of struggle, if you experienced those things, what helped you overcome that in the process?
Yeah, I don't really think that writer's block is an actual thing. I think there
Okay.
are times when we are called to do different things, and that is part of the writing process if you're a writer. I think that like my biggest, I guess, block, so to speak, or struggle in the last few years is that I really struggle to read. I struggled to read novels specifically, and it's partly because I studied literature in university, and it was just very, very hard to dive back into reading books for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
and and I think that there are other ways to engage with literary things, like film, music, art. Sometimes we don't always have, like, sometimes when we're percolating on an idea, it doesn't really make sense to write something when you're still percolating, when you're still processing something. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
like sometimes it seems like a writer just suddenly comes up with this 3-page thing or a 10-page thing or a 20-page thing, but actually they've been writing it in their head for like years. So I feel like just kind of honoring the process is, yeah, what I'll say about that.
Thank you for saying that. I've definitely have some that's been in my noggin for years. I think a lot of people have those, and it's such a liberating experience to put that on paper. And to externalize it in some ways. I also want to acknowledge for you say like writer's block, the way we conventionally think of it, the way it has been taught, that it may be a little bit of a myth. Do you want to say more about it, or you feel like it's pretty self-explanatory?
I think that like when you think about writing as you are supposed to constantly do it, and it'll just, when you decide that when you're going to write is when you're going to write, you are sort of assuming that you're a writer by default,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that what's actually happening for writers is that they write because they have something to say. That's why, people are not going to respond well if you are, say, a white writer writing about a topic relevant to people of color and not acknowledging their positionality. To put it another way, like, writing for writing's sake is not a helpful way to think about this work.
Yeah,
People are
yeah.
writing because they have something to say, because writing has a role in the world. Otherwise, why don't we become technical writers or work for marketing, work
Right.
for communications?
You can do that to pay the bills,
Yes,
by the way. That's
absolutely.
technical writer, financial writer.
Yes,
If you know
we
how to
need
write
both.
about it, great.
Right? It's like we need like all kinds of writing, but like writing as literature or art or commentary or political insight, that is a different kind of thing, because there is like a incubation process. You plant the seed and the flower comes out a few months later. And that whole thing is the writing process technically. If you're not technically putting like words to the page, that isn't writer's block. That is, you're doing something else while
Right.
preparing to put words to the page.
Right. Thank you for that distinction. It's also why sometimes I personally can struggle with following like the artist way or one of those, right? Because I kind of can't always just make it happen because I've decided to sit down to try to make something happen. Yeah, and you kind of talk about it from this way of being the artist in some, meaning, you even say this in your final acknowledgments at the end of your collection, your book. The experience of being held through this writing and publishing journey has been a poem in and of itself. And that, certain aspects of your life is almost poetry. Sometimes you have to just let things happen and allow things to happen on their own terms. But yeah, what did you mean by, specifically, I'll read this here, I'm indebted to the care and grace that my loved ones extended me throughout writing this collection. Thank you for holding me when I didn't know how. That too is a poem. So I guess I'm just curious if you could unpack that a little bit.
So, like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, did the tree fall? It's kind of like that. But in this context, it's like we make an active decision to decide that our life is poetry. And we can do that if we want to. And sometimes we don't think it's poetry. We think it's all crap. And I think that there is something very like scary and daring to write poetry in a world that is trying to say, let's just scroll social media or like mindlessly consume, or to put it more broadly, it's like, how do we make meaning in our lives? And of course, like, yeah, like a lot of the poems that I write about are about my friendships and about my loved ones, and like I see the poetry in my life. I see the poetry
exactly.
in the love and care that people show me. Yeah, that was kind of my way of reflecting back onto people.
Okay, so taking all of this in, having the support, the community, the publishing, the engagement, the rewards in some ways, does that inform your writing practice going forward in any way? I guess this is my way of teeing up, anything else on the horizon for you and that you're taking away from this whole journey?
I honestly haven't really thought about it. Like, I think that, like, I have way more to say. I have way more to write about. Yeah. I don't know if it'll be another poetry collection anytime soon, just because I'm also a prose writer, and sometimes there are more essays than poems. And
That's awesome. Yeah.
But like, I think that like as a disabled poet specifically, I think that I have to be mindful of the process, because I think that there is a lot of messaging out there that suggests, oh, you have to come out with another project right away, and that is like a pace that maybe doesn't necessarily work for me. Like the thing is, like, this collection took like probably more than 5 years. So, like, realistically, like, longer projects would take around that time for me to do. So, but I really enjoyed working on it, and it was very fulfilling to have one day you don't have the collection, and then another day it comes into your house in a big box.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's I can only imagine in some ways, without having, a poetry collection published in this way and everything, just, when you can still recall the times when it was a safe document in your old computer all the way to now. Not that people are obligated to write or to be a writer, but that's such a incredible experience despite all the challenges that lie inside of it, as you mentioned. And also thank you for acknowledging again that you're not doing this for the sake of doing it with regards to pacing and being mindful of disability and things like that. You're practicing what you preach.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you want to kind of mention or put on the table, as I like to say, particularly for listeners who would like to try poetry or for aspiring and beginning writers specifically?
So recently, David Lynch passed away.
Mm-hmm.
David Lynch is the director of Twin Peaks. I had forgotten that I really liked Twin Peaks, and I went to rewatch it, and I was like, oh man, this is so good.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that he said to an artist when the artist asked him, do you have any advice for me as an emerging artist? And he's like, no. There is something so interesting about that response, because it's sort of saying like another artist is not going to be able to tell you how to make your art.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about that a lot, because another person is not going to tell you how to be yourself. Another person is not going to tell you how you show up when you're dating people. Another person is not going to tell you how to make the art that you want to put out in the world. So I feel like my biggest thing is just like, how do you cultivate an environment for yourself where you can be fully yourself?
Yeah.
I think about this a lot when it comes to all kinds of art, and it's like so important to me, because it's like we live in a world where it's like everything is kind of memes, or like people are trying to get you to be someone you're not all the time under capitalism and colonialism. Yeah, when it comes to like putting your work out there, it's like, what can you do to make your poem or piece more of itself? If somebody tells you, hey, it reminds me of this, and you're like, no, that's not what I meant. How do you make that more of what you actually meant? And then afterwards, just kind of like trust the process, know that you can't control. After you put the work out there, it's like, it's almost like no longer yours. Letting go is important and very hard. And then maybe more practical things, like I find it sometimes intimidating to figure out how to make like other poet friends, but that is like super important, like having people that you trust with whom you could like, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Yeah, just kind of like finding your people when it comes to people who are interested in the same kind of style as you.
I love hearing this, and I'm so glad I asked you about this, because you're right. First of all, in a world that's, you said, very cookie cutter, that resonated with me. I heard something recently online that was like, there's a lot of trying to make sameness happen in the name of equality, even though that's not what equality is, right? Sameness. So I hear a little bit of that. I'm curious, as a follow-up question, the people who really were a net positive in your publishing and writing journey, who did show up for you, rather than advice, what did they bring you?
I do think that they offer me advice, but
yeah, sometimes, right? Yeah.
Like practical things, right? But I really do think it's like that mirroring, like support.
Yeah.
Like holding and creating space for your voice. Like, I think that's actually the most important part.
Yeah.
Because sometimes writers self-censor or self-reject, or feel like their work is not up to par or whatever.
Yeah.
Especially for marginalized writers who are responding to a tradition of very specific kinds of writing. And you're like, who am I to do this work? Quote unquote, imposter syndrome.
Right.
So I think that the most impactful thing is just someone supporting you and saying, hey, I believe in your work. I don't know. I was recently watching the Great Canadian Baking Show.
Me too. Oh my God, it's so good, especially as a distraction from some of 2025. But go on.
Every single baker was there for a reason. And every single criticism or feedback they got was because the judges knew that they could do better. And obviously, like, baking competition and writing is a little bit different, but there is like that sort of like supportive feedback that they're receiving, and watching the bakers support each other through. It was really heartwarming, and towards like all throughout the show they're starting to say like this type of move is so specific to you as a baker, and it's sort of like them reflecting back to them what they're doing that they may not see that they're doing.
Yeah, and just creating a container of safety, which honestly has come up a lot recently. There's like meeting deadlines and needing to put in the time and effort, but a lot of the things comes back to, even in today's conversation, this wasn't planned, but you talked about your poetry collection as an experience of protecting yourself, and out of that came this collection. But there's just something that's been resonating lately in all of my conversations with writers that's around creating a space where safety is possible, including something like Bake Off. If you're sick or things are happening, you're safe to try to do your best as a baker in that setting. And I feel that the same way in writers groups and things like that. I mean, there's beyond the prestige or like someone famous and things like that, the ones that were the most life-changing were the ones where we kind of felt safe to experiment or to take risks. And I hear a little bit of that maybe in some of what you're sharing.
Absolutely. Like receiving like genuine support is the lifeblood of creativity.
I mean, like in those spaces, then I can be like, don't hold back, I can take it. And suddenly like, but that took, it was like an organic thing of establishing safety within the group, rather than anything specific logistical, So thank you for sharing that for writers, and more for us to think about today. I really appreciate your time today and any interesting journeys that we had, but I really look forward to catching up with you again sometimes. And if people would like to connect with you for any reason or just find more of your work online, where can they find you?
They can find me at janeshi.org or on social media. I am one of those people who did not delete anything, but I am at Pipagao Poetry, which is spelled Pipapao Poetry. And
I will link it as well. Thank you for being the audiophile of today's conversation.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.